In my talk, I would like to present a study that we're currently finishing, looking at the modulation of somatosensory processing by visual and auditory moving stimuli in newborn babies. So of course, a newborn's baby everyday life experience is quite different from ours. First of all, they spend quite a lot of time asleep, and then when they're not asleep, they're often lying down, they have a different perception of the environment, but also at the same time, in the limited amount of time that they spend awake since they're born, it's quite likely that they will often experience approaching visual and auditory stimuli. For example, if a caregiver is moving towards them, so as they approach them, they will possibly hear their voice getting louder and see them getting bigger in the visual field. And these visual and auditory approaching cues will often be followed by tactile cues on the body as the baby gets picked up from the caregivers, for example. And we wondered if and how these early multisensory experiences could help to give rise to a sense of body and the world, and in particular, if it could help them to learn about the interaction between the body and the environment around them. So before I go into this study, I just want to give a tiny bit of background about what we know on how adults perceive this interaction between body and environment, and in particular on the fact that we know that adults are sensitive to cross-modal predictive relationship between moving objects in external space and tactile stimuli on the body. And this sensitivity happens thanks to predictive mechanisms that use visual motion cues to anticipate the time and location of a tactile stimulus, which is spatially and temporally distant from the cue, and to enhance tactile processing at the time and location of contact. So first of all, we thought that possibly a precursory requirement of these predictive mechanisms is sensitivity to visual-tactile cross-modal interactions that happen across spatio-temporal gaps. So we know that there's previous research looking at how infants respond to audio-tactile and visual-tactile stimuli that are presented at the same time and space. But the key difference here is that these stimuli are separated both spatially and temporally and are in a predictive relationship with each other. So this is something that we looked into recently, and we looked at whether infant EEG responses to touches on the bodies are modulated by the direction of previously presented visual motion towards or away from the body. So we presented the babies with motion, and actually we had a little cartoon animal moving at the top of the screen because we didn't want them to visually track the motion, so we wanted them to see it but not to focus on it, so that any effects that we would find would not be driven by them tracking the visual motion. The visual motion was followed by a gap, so that theoretically they would have to make up the remainder of the trajectory, and then the gap was followed by, in 50% of the trials, a touch on the hands. And the reason why we had that on 50% of the trials only is because we wanted to be able to measure purely the effect of the modulation. So we wanted to be able to calculate the difference wave between the touch and no touch trials, so that any aspects of the response that would be driven purely by visual components of the simulation would be cancelled out by the subtraction. So we've done that in babies aged 4 months and 8 months. In the 4-month-olds, we found quite a sustained difference in the response, and particularly we found a larger response to touches following approaching motion as opposed to receding motion. In the 8-month-olds, we found supposedly nothing, which was quite surprising because we found the effect in the younger babies, so we were like, oh, how comes that they lose this sensitivity growing up? So we looked at the data more closely, including in a mixed model, age in days of the participants, and what looks like is that at 8 months, we might be seeing a switch in the polarity of the responses, with the younger babies in the group showing the same pattern of responses as the 4-month-olds, and the older ones showing the opposite pattern with larger responses to receding stimuli, to touch following receding stimuli. And we thought that possibly this could be an early sign of prediction error processing coming up. But in any case, we see different processing of somatosensory information depending on previous temporally and spatially separated visual motion from 4 months. At the same time, 4 months it's quite early still because they're not acting purposefully on the environment, but at the same time, they already have a lot of experience. They try to reach, they've seen lots of objects, people moving around them, parents moving around them, picking them up. So we thought, why don't we try and move even younger? And we try and look at how, whether newborns' EEG responses to touches on the hands could be also modulated by preceding visual or auditory motion towards or away from the body. So this study was quite similar to the infant one, but there are a few key differences, which I'm going to try to highlight. So first of all, we introduced the auditory modality, and this was for two reasons. One, purely practical. Newborn babies sleep a lot. This study was not done in a hospital, it was done in a lab, so there were chances where they would just not wake up in the time they were with us. But also, most importantly, prenatally, they obviously have a lot more auditory than visual experience, so we wanted to be able to compare how they would do in the two modalities soon after birth. We also removed the gap between motion and tactile stimuli because we thought as a first step it might be computationally too complicated for them. So at this point with newborns, we're not talking about in any way about predictions or making speculations about prediction. We're just talking about possibly being sensitive to the continuity between approach and touches. And finally, we didn't focus on them not attending the visual moving stimuli because we knew we could not do the same with the auditory domain. We can't tell whether they are attending it or not. And this is our setup. Babies were in parents' arms, sitting quite a lot more upright than in the photo, but this is the best photo we've got so far. And then they would be presented with the auditory study, and if they were awake, also the visual study. The studies are quite similar. We have the motion, approaching or receding, visual or auditory, followed by a touch in 50% of the trial and response collection time. So for the auditory study, we've just finished our data collection. We have 21 newborns. Instead, for the visual study, we still have a bit to go, and this is mostly because quite a lot of the babies just didn't wake up. Now, I just want to show you a quick video of a few trials from the studies. It goes quite quickly, so I'm just going to tell you beforehand. So for the visual study, in the bottom left, there will be what the babies are looking at. Instead, for the auditory study, there will be nothing. And in the top left, you will see a little lightning bolt when they were feeling a touch. And you'll see they have some tape around their hands. The tape was used to keep the tactile stimulation devices in place. So this is how it looked like. This is the no-touch condition, which is identical, just they weren't perceiving any touch. Obviously, it's quite hard to hear the different directions of the sounds here, but it was a lot better in the lab. So we have our no-touch condition. This is 5 example participants in the time window between 300 and 400 milliseconds after the touch. We have a touch condition, but we are interested in how the touch response is modulated by what they have heard or seen previously. So again, as in the infant studies, we computed a difference wave between touch and no-touch trials. And the first thing that we notice is that in the newborn babies, we find that the topographies are wildly different across participants. These are just 5 example participants, but they're all very different to each other, which is not something we found in the 4-month-olds. So in the 4-month-olds, even both for the touch itself, but also for the modulation, we found quite consistent hotspots over somatosensory areas, more or less. So while this is quite interesting in itself and something that we want to look into more to see what is causing this, at the same time, it made us decide against a classic ERP approach because we found it would be really difficult to choose a representative cluster of electrodes when the topographies look like this. So we decided to use instead global field power as a global index of the presence of a scalp field. So basically global field power is the standard deviation of the potential across the scalp, so it's telling us that something is happening, doesn't matter where. And then to pick the latencies to investigate, we use a topographic consistency test, which helps us to determine at which points in time we could actually see consistent activation of a set of electric brain sources across participants, which was, again, something that we did to make sure that we could compare the data across the participants, given the wildly different topographies that we've seen. So for the auditory study, this is the global field power in the approaching sound condition, and this is the result of the topographic consistency test. So essentially, the topographic consistency test is telling us that between about 320 and 540 milliseconds, we have a consistent activation of a set of brain electric sources across different participants, which is quite widespread on the scalp. Fairly similar in the receding sound condition. And we haven't managed yet to do the actual analysis, so this is just a representation, but if we look at the global field powers compared to each other, it looks like in that time window where the topographic consistency test showed us that we have a common activation across participants, it looks like the response is larger for touch following approaching versus receding motion, which is consistent with what we find in our 4-month-old participants. For the visual study, just bear in mind this is like 30% less participants, and also they all have a lot less trials because, of course, their visual attention is much shorter than the auditory attention. And this is approaching sound condition. Here we find a consistent activation of common electric brain sources across participants for a bit of a longer time, between 230 and 730 milliseconds. And the same goes for the receding sound, although again, this might change. However, here, if we look at the comparison between the global field power, again, only visually for now, the pattern looks less clear. So overall, we see that in the auditory study, what looks like for now, and hopefully maybe our statistics will confirm, is that we see a larger amplitude of the global field power in response to the touch following approaching versus receding motion, which is consistent with what we see in our 4-month-old participants and could possibly indicate that already soon after birth, babies could perceive continuity between approaching motion and touch in the auditory domain. In the visual study so far, we see a less clear pattern, and we wonder whether this could be possibly an effect of experience because, of course, at birth, babies have, our participants again are between 9 and 40 days of life, so they have varying degrees of visual experience, but still all of them have less visual experience than they have auditory experience from in utero. And then also we found unexpectedly there's quite different topographies for the multisensory modulation effect in the newborns, which we don't find in the 4-month-olds. And this is something that we didn't expect, but also something that we are keen on looking more into because it's actually quite interesting, and we wonder what could be driving it, and our guess is that it might be a maturation or myelination possibly. In fact, the other thing that we want to look into is actually the effect of maturation and experience in modulating these responses. And then our other a bit more ambitious directions with this is to try and explore prenatally, to try and look before babies are born, how, if and how they respond to this kind of multisensory stimuli, and also to look at what happens in babies that have a different experience in their first few days of life. So, for example, babies who spend a few days or weeks in neonatal intensive care, and therefore they will experience less these associations between like people coming close to them and picking them up, for example. And with that, I'd like to thank you and to all the babies and families who took part in our research, my collaborators and our funders.
Thank you, Giulia, for this really nice presentation. We have a lot of time for questions.
So going back to the 4 versus 8-month-old results at the earlier part of your talk, I was curious if...
Sorry, which study?
The one where you see this crossover effect,
yes.
Where... so I was wondering if the response to... the response to receding, rather than looking at that as an age split, is there a difference based on whether they're capable of sort of self-motion or self-locomotion? Like being able to, at 8 months is like some babies are crawling, not all of them. But even the ones who aren't crawling, some of them have figured out other ways of sort of either scooting across the floor or kind of rolling. So is there a difference in basically their ability to chase receding sounds that might explain this?
That's actually a really good question. So we collected measures, parent-reported measures of motor development, and the reason we did that was that because we wanted to have a group of participants that were comparable in terms of motor development, because of course we thought, well, this is moving objects, so their motor development could have an impact, so we want to make sure we don't have any babies that are either catching up with their peers or particularly advanced. And if any participants were like more than 2 standard deviations above or below, they would be excluded, but this was never the case. And when we ran the models, we also tried to correlate with gross motor development, but we didn't find an effect there, only age. but that it's definitely something worth looking into some more. And we are now trying to get an older age group as well as adults to see if we get a full reversal of the effect in maybe 10-month-olds, for example. Also because we have some other data from tactile responses in 8-month-olds that also look a bit funny. So it might be that there's just something going on that is confusing. But yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you.
There was a question in the back. Mara, weren't you?
Thank you. It's a really nice talk and a great paradigm, and I wish you good luck getting the rest of the data. I just have a tiny suggestion, and that is I'm intrigued by your idea of looking at preterm babies, but I would offer you the suggestion that you look at late preterm infants who are healthy and not in the NICU. Because what it would let you do, I mean, you could, of course, do anything, right? You could look at both groups, but what that lets you do is to compare maturational age, but hold constant that they're living in homes and they're not near beeps, et cetera. So as your question is about teasing apart the role of maturation and exposure, you might look at that group. There's a fair amount of work done with that.
Thank you. That's actually a really good point. Thank you.
Do we have more questions? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. For the newborn babies, if I understood correctly, in the auditory condition, they were always asleep, or sometimes they were awake?
No, sometimes they were awake. So we wanted to have a study that we were able to run even if they were asleep, partly also to sort of like reward the families for their efforts in coming in with sometimes a really, really young baby. Some, I don't have the numbers here. Most of them were either dozing off or asleep. Some of them were awake. Some of them were really like trying to stay awake, which was quite sweet. So normally, in practical terms, we decided the order of presentation based on baby status. So if they came in awake, we would do the visual study first, and often that would tire them out, and they would go to sleep for the auditory study, but sometimes they would just stay awake. And that's something that we have been recording. We've not looked into whether it makes any difference as of yet, but also because with 21 babies, I don't feel too confident doing that, but it's something to look into for sure.
Yeah, I was wondering for the topographies, if you maybe look into the ones who were asleep and the ones who were awake, that could be interesting too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have time for one really quick question.
This is a quick question. Thanks for a lovely talk. I'm wondering again about this auditory condition in the newborns. So there are certain sounds that they might actually have experienced approaching them, leading to picking them up. Particularly, I'm thinking of the sound of footsteps approaching them. I'm wondering if you might expect stronger effects given the potential role of experience here, even for the 26-day-old newborns, because it seems like if you used more realistic sounds such as footsteps approaching, do you think that you'd maybe find more consistent expectations of touch than for a more abstract sound that might require generalization from what they have experienced to a more abstract type of sound?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. So we decided to use these sounds particularly because we have previous data from a behavioral study where we showed that newborn, like actual tiny newborn babies, less than 3 days old, would match approaching visual and auditory motion with these particular sounds. So we felt relatively confident that they would be perceived as approaching or receding. But yes, definitely, it could be that with using more ecological sounds, potentially even the parents' voices, the effect will get even stronger. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Giulia.